Under the soft light of the White House briefing room, the air carries the weight of distant suffering. Reporters gather as U.S. fierce. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt steps to the podium, her words measured but resolute. The United States is actively engaged in efforts to bring about a peaceful resolution to the terrible conflict in Sudan, she says. The conflict she refers to is one of Africa's most devastating in recent memory, a brutal struggle between Sudan's army and the Rapid Support Forces that has torn apart cities, families, and hopes of democracy. For over 2 years, Sudan has bled in silence. Tens of thousands have died and millions have been displaced, forced to flee not only from bullets, but from hunger and disease. In Khartoum, the once bustling capital, shells have turned homes into graves. In Darfur, where genocide once scarred the nation's conscience, reports of ethnic killings have resurfaced, hauntingly familiar and unbearably tragic. Leavitt's remarks signal a renewed sense of urgency in Washington. The Biden administration, now under the watch of its second term, appears determined to reassert diplomatic leverage in Africa's war zones after months of global distraction by other crises. She adds, we remain committed to working with our international partners, including Quad members, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as well as others, to lead a negotiated peace process that addresses both the immediate humanitarian crisis and the longer-term political challenges. Behind her words lies a complex web of diplomacy. The so-called Quad for Sudan, comprising the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom, has been trying with limited success to broker talks between Sudan's rival generals, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who commands the National Army, and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, widely known as Hemedti, leader of the Rapid Support Forces. Previous attempts at ceasefires have collapsed within days, each one shattering more trust than it built. The streets of Omdurman, Port Sudan and Nyala have become battlegrounds of despair as both sides trade artillery fire and accusations of war crimes. Humanitarian groups, meanwhile, struggle to reach trapped civilians. Aid convoys are routinely looted and relief workers risk their lives to deliver food or medicine. At the United Nations in New York, diplomats describe Sudan as a forgotten emergency. UN officials estimate that over 25 million people now require urgent assistance, while famine looms in the Darfur and Kordofan regions. Hospitals have been destroyed or occupied by armed groups. Water systems have collapsed, and thousands of women have reported cases of sexual violence in displacement camps. For Washington, the stakes are not only humanitarian, they're strategic. Sudan's Red Sea coastline makes it a vital node in the competition for influence among regional powers. Egypt fears instability spilling across its southern border, Saudi Arabia and the UAE eye the region's trade routes, while Russia, according to intelligence reports, continues to pursue a naval base in Port Sudan. Amid this geopolitical tug-of-war, the US has quietly increased diplomatic engagement. Envoys have shuttled between Jeddah, Cairo and Addis Ababa, seeking a formula that neither side will reject outright. But progress remains painfully slow. The White House insists it is not acting alone. Behind the scenes, US officials are coordinating with African and Arab mediators, from the Intergovernmental Authority on Development IGAD to the African Union. Yet, despite countless meetings, the violence persists. Each day brings new footage of bombed neighborhoods, mass graves and malnourished children in makeshift shelters. The conflict's roots trace back to the failed democratic transition after the 2019 overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's longtime dictator. That revolution had promised freedom and civilian rule. But the uneasy power-sharing deal between the army and the RSF collapsed into war in April 2023, when Burhan and Hemedti turned their guns on each other, a betrayal of the revolution they once claimed to protect. Now, in 2025, the consequences are staggering. More than 10 million Sudanese have fled their homes. Neighbouring countries, Chad, South Sudan and Egypt, are straining under the refugee influx. The World Food Programme warns that large parts of Sudan could face outright famine by year's end if access doesn't improve. Karoline Leavitt's statement is one of cautious resolve, but it reflects a larger question: can diplomacy still reach those who have stopped listening? Behind her, the US flag stands still as cameras click. She avoids revealing details of the American proposal. But sources familiar with the talks say Washington's plan involves a phased ceasefire monitored by regional observers, coupled with a civilian-led transitional roadmap backed by economic incentives and reconstruction aid. Such proposals have failed before, but officials argue that the political context is shifting. Inside Sudan, both the army and RSF are exhausted. Their military resources are stretched, and civilian resistance committees continue to demand peace and accountability. International patience is also wearing thin. In Geneva, UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk has condemned repeated atrocities, warning that the scale of civilian suffering in Darfur could rival the horrors of 2003. He described scenes of entire villages burned, marketplaces shelled, and aid workers shot in convoys. The world cannot afford to look away from Sudan, Turk said recently. Every delay in diplomacy costs human lives. The United States, critics say, has been inconsistent in its approach. Early in the conflict, Washington imposed targeted sanctions on RSF and army-linked entities, freezing assets and restricting travel. But humanitarian groups argue sanctions alone won't stop the bloodshed. What's needed is a sustained diplomatic push and pressure on regional backers supplying arms to both factions. Analysts in Washington describe Sudan as a test case for America's credibility in Africa. After years of focusing on Ukraine, Israel and the Indo-Pacific, the continent's crises from Sudan to the Sahel have risked falling off the global radar. Leavitt's words, therefore, are an attempt to place Sudan back at the centre of international attention. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers across party lines have urged stronger engagement. Senator Chris Coons, a longtime Africa advocate, has called for a special envoy with cabinet-level authority to coordinate international mediation. Others, including Conservative voices, have criticised the administration for outsourcing the process to Gulf allies whose priorities may diverge from humanitarian goals. For the families inside Sudan, however, such debates feel distant. In Port Sudan, one of the few functioning cities left under government control, displaced families crowd into schools, turned shelters. We just want to go home, says Aisha, a mother of 4 who fled Khartoum. We have no food, no medicine, and no idea when this war will end. The humanitarian toll has spilled across borders. In Chad, refugee camps near Adre are now among the largest in Africa. Aid groups warn of collapsing sanitation and rising child malnutrition. South Sudan, itself recovering from years of civil war, struggles to absorb tens of thousands of returnees. Even as diplomatic meetings continue, airstrikes and ground clashes show no sign of abating. Satellite images analysed by conflict monitors reveal scorched towns and looted markets in Darfur. Social media is flooded with videos of civilians pleading for evacuation. In Washington, administration officials defend their efforts. They argue that diplomacy is a process of persistence, not instant results. The Jeddah framework, though fragile, remains the only channel both generals have ever agreed to engage with. The White House hopes incremental humanitarian pauses could build toward a more durable truce. Still, skepticism remains. Analysts point out that without enforcement mechanisms or regional peacekeepers, any ceasefire could collapse as swiftly as it forms. Others warn that both Burhan and Hemedti may be more interested in consolidating power than sharing it. In a rare moment of agreement, both warring parties have recently signalled interest in resuming indirect talks. Sources close to the African Union confirm that envoys are preparing a new round of discussions in Addis Ababa with the backing of the Quad and the UN Special Envoy for Sudan, Ramtane Lamamra. If successful, such talks could pave the way for limited humanitarian corridors, a lifeline for millions trapped by fighting. But few are optimistic. Every ceasefire announcement has been followed by fresh gunfire. The question now is whether US engagement can shift that pattern or whether Washington's words will fade, as so many have before, into the background noise of another forgotten war. As Karoline Leavitt leaves the podium, reporters shout follow-up questions. What does the truce entail? Will Washington send observers? Is there a timeline for peace? She declines to elaborate. Her message is brief but intentional. Diplomacy is still alive, and the United States, she insists, is very engaged. Outside, the world carries on. But in the ruins of Khartoum, in the scorched fields of Darfur, and in the crowded tents of refugee camps stretching into Chad, Sudan's people wait for aid, for safety, for hope, and for the promise that somewhere far from the sound of gunfire, their suffering is still being heard.